When we talk about fiscal policies, what we're really talking about is economics, because our fiscal policy is how we deal with money. So let's talk about Ford and Carter's fiscal policies in the 70s. One of the big issues inherited by the Ford and Carter administrations was the energy crisis brought on by the OPEC oil embargo of 73 and 74. The initial context of this was the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, which was one of a long line of conflicts between Israel and surrounding Arab nations in the Middle East. In this conflict, like in all conflicts of this kind, the United States took the side of Israel. In response, OPEC instituted an oil embargo against the United States. This led in turn to gas shortages within the United States as oil companies started rationing. It's worth pointing out that it's not necessarily that the US had run out of oil or that companies didn't have any, but more that they wanted to make sure that they were rationing the oil that they did have so that they'd have a steady amount through the entirety of the month. This is especially true since we know from our own experiences with a gas shortage in Texas in 2017 and runs on things like toilet paper and other paper products during COVID that when Americans even think that there might be a shortage of something, we go out and irrationally stock up on massive quantities of it. And so gas companies and gas station owners put limits on how much people could buy so that this wouldn't happen. And this led to massive lines at the gas pump and sometimes price gouging, which people would then have to report to the government since that's actually illegal. But the biggest thing to really come out of this was that during Carter's administration, he founds the Department of Energy with the purpose of looking into alternative sources of, well, energy. Because we start to realize that one, issues in the Middle East aren't going to go away, and we don't want to be dependent on them all the time. But two, we also need to start looking into more than just really oil and coal as our main sources of energy in this country. And so the DOE's job is to find ways to use the energy resources that we have here more efficiently, but also to help find ways of producing more forms of energy that are more sustainable in the future. The Carter administration also focused on reform in banking and credit policies. Since 1934, with the establishment of the National Housing Act, banks and housing agencies had engaged in a process called redlining, which you can see here on the map on the left. What this means is that the areas in red on the map indicate people in a particular city who are more likely to default on a loan or mortgage based on race and/or class. The next most likely are in the yellow zone, and so on and so forth. So when you went to a bank and asked for a loan in order to purchase a new home or renovate your current home, they'd ask for your current zip code. And if you lived in one of these areas, you'd likely be rejected, which also means you didn't even have to go into the bank in order to be rejected. They could identify who you were and usually what race you were, even if you had mailed in your application or did it over the phone, because the cities were so purposefully segregated. So the purpose of the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, in 1977 is to reverse a lot of this. The idea was that if banks had largely created the process of redlining and the problems associated with it, they'd have to be the ones to help rectify that problem. So this law doesn't specifically require banks to give loans to specific people or groups or communities of people, but it does give banks a CRA rating based on who they're lending to. So if a bank refuses to give equitable loans and then they want to turn around and ask the government for a bailout later or for permission to do a merger or something else, they can be denied for that. Essentially, the government says that they don't have to follow these rules, but if they ever think they'll want something from the government, which they definitely will, it's in their best interest to. Which is why you hear all the time now that banks will advertise themselves as like an equal opportunity lender and such. Starting really in the mid-60s, arguably the biggest fiscal problem faced by Nixon, Ford, and Carter was stagflation. This is a term used to describe an economic condition where you have both high unemployment and high inflation. So the economy is essentially stagnant, hence stagflation. The OPEC oil embargo only added to the problem in the early 70s by adding to inflation. Ford tried to solve the problem by limiting government spending and cutting the money supply to decrease the inflation part at least. This didn't work. By the time Carter came into office, unemployment was at 7.4%. He tried to expand the money supply again, essentially reversing Ford's decision, but this made inflation skyrocket again. The Federal Reserve decided to dial the money supply back again, which then led to increases in unemployment up to over 10%. Carter then tried to deregulate some businesses, mostly transportation and banking, thinking that perhaps the competition between them would drive economic growth. This seemed to make the business owners happy, but actively hurt consumers, especially those who depended on those services in more rural areas. So by the end of the Ford and Carter administrations, traditional attempts to fix the unemployment issue and or the inflation issue fell flat. When Reagan came into office, his own attempts at fixing the nation's economic issues, a program referred to as Reaganomics, received mixed reviews.